Commander Zarathic stood on the observation deck of the military station and watched the stars through the thick glass. Her forearms moved slowly as she cleaned her plasma rifle for the third time that day. The weapon had served her well through 30 years of war across the galaxy. She had fought beside warriors from many different worlds, and each one had taught her something new about battle. The tall insect-like alien remembered her first fight with the Andromedan soldiers. They were careful and smart. They planned every move and never took risks they did not need to take. When they fought, they used their machines and computers to win battles before the enemy knew what was happening. Zarathic learned patience from them. Then came the years with the Centauri fighters. These cat-like beings were strong and fast and loved to fight. They would charge into battle with loud roars and sharp claws. They taught her that sometimes a warrior needed to be brave and fierce to win the day. Their courage was like fire that burned away fear. The vegan mind readers were different again. They could speak to each other without words, and knew what the enemy was thinking before the enemy acted. Fighting with them was like being part of one big brain that could see everything at once. From them she learned that knowing your enemy was as important as having good weapons. Each species brought something special to war. The rock people from Titan were strong and could not be hurt easily. The bird-like Altarians could fly and see great distances. The water beings from Neptune could fight in any liquid and change their shape when needed. Zarathic had fought with them all and understood how to use their gifts to win battles. Now the human ships were coming to join the fight against the Kreth invaders. Zarathic had heard stories about these new aliens called humans, but she had never seen one. The reports said they were small and weak compared to most galactic species. They had no special powers like mind-reading or shape-changing. They could not fly or breathe underwater or lift heavy rocks with ease. Their skin was soft and their bones could break. The human ships looked ordinary too. They were not as fast as Centauri fighters or as strong as Andromedan battleships. Their weapons were basic plasma guns and metal projectiles. Nothing about them seemed special or dangerous. Zarathic wondered why the High Command wanted these weak creatures as allies. The transport ship docked with a soft sound, and the airlock opened. Zarathic watched as the human soldiers walked out. They were indeed small and looked fragile in their simple armor. Their faces were covered with soft skin and hair, instead of proper battle scales or chitin. They moved on only 2 legs, which seemed like a bad design for fighting. One human walked toward her. He was average height for his species, with brown hair and calm eyes. His uniform was clean, but not fancy. The name tag on his chest said Murphy. He stopped in front of her and made a gesture with his hand that she recognized as a human greeting. "Commander Zarathic, I am Staff Sergeant Jake Murphy. I have been assigned to your unit for the joint operations." His voice was steady and respectful, but not afraid. Zarathic looked down at this small creature. He barely reached the middle of her chest and probably weighed less than one of her arms. She had seen house pets on some worlds that looked more dangerous than this human. Yet he stood straight and met her gaze without backing away. "Welcome, Sergeant Murphy. Have you fought the Kreth before?" she asked through her translator device. "No, Commander. This will be my first time fighting them. But I have read all the reports and studied their tactics. I am ready to do my part." Jake's answer was simple and direct. Zarathic made a note. In her mind, the human seemed confident, but not foolish. He admitted he was new to this enemy, but had tried to learn about them. This was good. Too many young warriors thought they knew everything and got themselves killed in their first real battle. The briefing room was filled with warriors from 6 different species. Each group sat with their own kind and spoke in their own languages. The humans sat quietly in one corner. Jake Murphy listened as the mission commander explained their first operation together. "Intelligence reports suggest the Kreth have a small outpost on the moon, Helios 7. We will conduct a reconnaissance mission to gather information about their numbers and positions. This should be a simple operation, with minimal enemy contact. The Andromedon captain asked detailed questions about sensor readings and defensive positions. The Centauri leader wanted to know if they would get to fight anything worth fighting. The vegan representative closed her eyes and tried to sense any psychic activity from the target area. Jake Murphy said nothing during the briefing. He took notes on a small device and studied the maps they were shown. When asked if he had any questions, he simply shook his head and said he understood the mission. After the briefing, Zarathic found herself walking beside the human as they headed to the equipment bay. She was curious about this quiet soldier who seemed so ordinary. "Tell me about human warfare, Sergeant. What makes your species good at fighting?" Jake thought for a moment before answering. "We are not the strongest or the fastest, Commander. We do not have special powers like some species. But we do not give up either. When we fight until the job is done." Zarathic clicked her mandibles in what might have been amusement. Every species said they were brave and determined. Every warrior claimed they would never surrender. But when the real fighting started, she would see what this human was really made of. The equipment check went smoothly. Jake's gear was standard issue and well maintained. His weapons were clean and functional, but nothing special. He moved with basic competence, but showed no signs of exceptional skill or training. Everything about him seemed perfectly average. As they prepared for departure, Zarathic assigned positions for the mission. The Andromedans would handle technical scanning. The Centauri would provide mobile assault capability. The vegans would watch for psychic threats. The humans would serve as general infantry support. Jake accepted his assignment without complaint. He checked his rifle one more time and settled into his seat on the transport ship. As the ship launched toward Helios 7, he closed his eyes and seemed to rest. Zarathic watched him and wondered if she had made the right choice, bringing such an inexperienced warrior on this mission. The reports called it a simple reconnaissance, but she had been fighting long enough to know that no mission was ever as simple as it seemed on paper. Soon they would land on that moon, and she would learn what humans were really like in battle. She hoped this Jake Murphy would not get himself or others killed with beginner mistakes. The war against the Kreth was too important to waste lives on warriors who could not handle real combat. The transport ship flew through space toward their destination, carrying warriors from different worlds toward what they all believed would be an easy first mission together. The landing on Helios 7 went wrong from the very first moment. The transport ship touched down in what should have been a safe zone, according to their intelligence reports. But as soon as the doors opened, plasma fire erupted from the rocky hills around them. The reconnaissance mission had become a battle before they even left the ship. Zarathic cursed in her native language as she dove for cover behind a boulder. Her forearms moved quickly to return fire while she tried to count the enemy positions. The Kreth had been waiting for them. This was not a small outpost but a major stronghold, with dozens of soldiers in prepared defensive positions. The captain was already working on his scanner, trying to get accurate numbers on the enemy force. His mechanical voice reported through the comm system that he detected at least 47 Kreth warriors in elevated positions around their landing zone. They were trapped in a canyon with steep walls on 3 sides, and enemy fire coming from the fourth. The Centauri fighters had spread out and were returning fire with their usual aggressive style, but even their courage could not overcome the disadvantage of being caught in the open against enemies who had good cover and high ground. One of the cat-like warriors was already wounded and bleeding green, blood onto the gray rocks. The vegan mind reader pressed her hand to her head and reported that she could sense many hostile thoughts around them. The Kreth were planning to keep them pinned down until reinforcements arrived. Then they would attack from multiple directions and kill or capture the entire joint force. Jake Murphy crouched behind a small rock that barely covered half his body. Plasma bolts flew over his head and struck the ground around him. He checked his rifle and counted his ammunition. He had enough for maybe 10 minutes of continuous fighting if he was careful with his shots. Zarethic activated her command channel and spoke to all units. We need to withdraw immediately. This position cannot be held. We will fall back to the transport and call for orbital support. It was the logical decision. Every military manual in the galaxy agreed that a force caught in such a disadvantageous position should retreat and regroup. The odds against them were too high for any reasonable chance of success. Even if they fought well, most of them would die for no good reason. But Jake Murphy had a different idea. "Commander, I am going to flank them from the east side." Jake's voice came through the comm system, calm and steady. Zarethic turned to look at the human. He was checking his weapon and preparing to move. She could not believe what she was hearing. "Sergeant, there are 47 confirmed enemies in prepared positions. You would have to cross open ground under direct fire. The mathematical probability of success is less than 12%. Jake looked back at her and shrugged. "Yeah, probably. But someone needs to create a distraction so the rest of you can get out safely." Before anyone could stop him, Jake Murphy stood up and ran directly toward the enemy positions. He moved in a zigzag pattern, dodging plasma bolts that came so close they singed his armor. He fired his rifle at the Kreth positions, not trying to hit specific targets, but just to keep their attention on him. Zarethic watched in shock as the human charged across the open ground. This was not tactics. This was not strategy. This was madness. No rational being would take such a risk when retreat was possible. Yet Jake kept running and shooting and somehow staying alive. The Kreth forces began to react in ways that surprised the veteran commander. These alien invaders were known for their logical approach to warfare. They calculated risks and made precise decisions based on mathematical probability. But the sight of one small human charging directly at them seemed to confuse their tactical programming. Some Kreth soldiers turned their weapons away from the main force to shoot at Jake. Others tried to coordinate a response to his unexpected attack. A few actually left their good defensive positions to get better angles on this lone attacker. Their organized defense began to break down as they focused on the human. Jake reached a pile of rocks about halfway to the enemy line and dove behind them. Plasma fire struck all around his position, but he kept shooting back. When his rifle ran low on ammunition, he pulled grenades from his belt and began throwing them at the Kreth positions. The explosions were not very effective against their stone fortifications, but they created dust and smoke that made it harder for the enemy to see. Jake used this confusion to move closer to their lines. He crawled and ran and rolled from cover to cover, always moving forward, even when common sense said he should go back. Zarethic found herself counting the minutes that Jake had been fighting alone. 5 minutes became 10, 10 became 15. The human should have been dead many times over, but he kept fighting. His ammunition was running low, and his grenades were gone, but he continued to advance on the enemy positions. The Kreth were making more and more mistakes. They wasted shots on areas where Jake had been, but was no longer. They called out positions to each other that were wrong or out of date. Some actually abandoned their safe positions to chase after him, leaving gaps in their defensive line. When Jake's rifle ammunition finally ran out completely, he did something that made Zarethic question everything she knew about rational warfare. He drew his combat knife and continued attacking, a blade against plasma rifles, one human against dozens of alien warriors. It was impossible and stupid, and somehow it was working. The Centauri captain growled over the comm channel. "This human fights like he has gone insane, but his madness is giving us openings we can use." The Andromedon agreed. "His irrational behavior is causing systematic failures in enemy coordination. We should advance while they are distracted." The vegan mindreader sounded confused. "I cannot predict his next action. His thoughts are focused only on moving forward and fighting. Nothing else exists for him right now." Zarethic realized that Jake's impossible attack had created exactly what they needed. The Kreth defensive positions were no longer coordinated. Gaps had opened in their lines. Individual enemies were making poor decisions based on trying to deal with one human who refused to follow any logical pattern of behavior. She gave the order to advance. The mixed force of alien warriors moved up from their defensive positions and began a coordinated assault on the confused Kreth forces. The battle that should have been a disaster for the joint force became a victory because one human had refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. When the fighting ended, they found Jake Murphy unconscious behind a Kreth fortification. He was bleeding from several wounds, and his armor was cracked and burned. His knife was still in his hand, and there were 7 dead Kreth soldiers around his position. Somehow he had fought his way through their entire defensive line with nothing but determination and a blade. The Andromedan medic worked quickly to stabilize Jake's injuries while the rest of the force secured the area. As they waited for medical evacuation, Zarathik stood over the unconscious human and tried to understand what she had witnessed. Every calculation said Jake Murphy should have died in the first 30 seconds of his attack. Every tactical analysis predicted complete failure. Yet here they stood victorious because this small, weak, ordinary human had decided that mathematics did not matter when his comrades needed him to act. The other species in the joint force gathered around Jake's unconscious form. The Centauri spoke of courage beyond reason. The Andromedans discussed variables they could not calculate. The vegans admitted they had never encountered a mind so focused on impossible goals. Zarathik looked down at Jake Murphy and realized she had learned something new about warfare. She had fought beside many different species and learned from each of them. But this human had shown her something she had never seen before. He had shown her what happened when a warrior simply refused to accept that defeat was possible. As the medical ship arrived to take Jake to the hospital, Zarathik made a decision. She would request that Sergeant Murphy be assigned permanently to her unit. She wanted to understand this human way of fighting. She wanted to learn what made them different from every other species in the galaxy. The mission reports would say that the joint force had successfully eliminated a Kreth stronghold through superior tactics and coordination. But Zarathik knew the truth. They had won because one human had decided that the odds did not matter when others were counting on him to fight. Jake Murphy recovered from his injuries faster than the alien doctors expected. Within 2 weeks, he was back on duty and ready for the next mission. Zarathik had indeed requested his permanent assignment to her unit, and the High Command had approved it. They were curious about the human who had single-handedly turned a failed reconnaissance into a successful assault. Over the following months, Zarathik observed Jake in 17 different battles against the Kreth invaders. Each engagement revealed new aspects of human behavior that challenged everything she thought she knew about warfare and military logic. The siege of Outpost Delta was supposed to be a simple defensive operation. The joint force had good positions and enough ammunition to hold out until reinforcements arrived. But the Kreth had brought heavy artillery that was slowly destroying their fortifications. Worse, they had set up a communication array that was calling more enemy forces to the area. The communication array was built into a tower on a hill surrounded by Kreth's soldiers. Getting to it would require crossing half a mile of open ground under constant fire. Even if someone reached it, the explosives needed to destroy it would have to be set manually. The person who took that mission would not be coming back. When the mission commander asked for volunteers, every species calculated the odds and found them unacceptable. The Andromedan said the probability of success was less than 3%. The Centauri admitted that even their greatest warriors could not survive such an assault. The vegan sensed only death at the end of that path. Jake Murphy raised his hand. "I will do it, sir." Zarathik pulled him aside before he left. "Sergeant, this is a suicide mission. You understand that you will not survive this action." Jake checked his weapons and equipment one more time. "Maybe, Commander. But if I do not try, We will all die when their reinforcements arrive. Someone has to take the chance. Zarathic watched through her scope as Jake began his impossible journey across the battlefield. He did not run in a straight line or follow any tactical pattern she recognized. Instead, he seemed to improvise his route moment by moment, using shell craters and debris for cover that should not have been adequate. When Kreth's soldiers shot at him, he used their muzzle flashes to locate their positions and returned fire. When their artillery targeted him, he moved just before the shells landed, as if he could sense where they would hit. When his path was blocked by enemy forces, he found ways around them that used the terrain in ways no tactical manual had ever described. Halfway to the tower, Jake's primary weapon was destroyed by shrapnel. Instead of retreating, he picked up a damaged Kreth rifle and continued forward. When that weapon failed, he improvised explosives from his remaining grenades and equipment. When those were exhausted, he continued with only his sidearm and knife. The Kreth defenders at the tower had been watching his approach and were ready for him. They had good cover and superior numbers. By every logical calculation, they should have killed him easily when he finally reached their position. But Jake Murphy did not attack them the way they expected. Instead of assaulting their fortified positions directly, he used the tower's structure against them. He climbed up the outside while under fire, using the metal framework for cover. When they tried to follow him, he dropped improvised explosives down on them. When they waited for him to come down, he rigged the communication equipment to overload and destroy itself. The explosion that destroyed the array also brought down most of the tower. Jake fell with it, landing hard on the rocky ground below. The Kreth soldiers at the base were killed by falling debris, and their communication with reinforcements was permanently cut off. Zarathic led the rescue team that found Jake in the wreckage. He was unconscious and badly injured, but alive. The mission that every computer said was impossible had been completed. The outpost was saved because one human had refused to accept that some things could not be done. The Battle of Iron Ridge was different, but showed the same pattern. Jake's squad had been cut off from the main force and surrounded by an entire Kreth battalion. Standard military protocol in such situations was clear: surrender if possible, fight to the death if surrender was not accepted. No force of 3 soldiers could hold out against hundreds of enemies for more than a few minutes. But Jake Murphy had different ideas about what was possible. For 6 hours, he and his 2 remaining squad mates held a position that should have been overrun in the first assault. Jake used every trick he had learned, and several he invented during the battle itself. He turned abandoned equipment into weapons, used the local environment as an ally, and somehow kept finding ways to make 3 soldiers fight like 30 when the Kreth tried mass frontal assaults. Jake used choke points and ambush tactics to break up their formations. When they tried to surround his position completely, he created diversions that made them think he had more soldiers than he actually did. When they brought up heavy weapons, he improvised ways to turn their own firepower against them. The most remarkable thing was not his tactical skill, though that was impressive. What amazed Zarathic was his refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless. Every time the Kreth thought they had him beaten, Jake found a new way to keep fighting. His 2 human squad mates followed his lead, fighting with the same impossible determination. When reinforcements finally arrived to relieve the position, they found Jake and his men still fighting. The area around their defensive position was littered with Kreth casualties. 3 humans had held off an entire battalion for 6 hours, through nothing but refusal to give up. Zarathic began keeping detailed notes on what she called human factors in warfare. These were variables that appeared nowhere in any military textbook she had studied, but seemed to be crucial for understanding how humans fought. The first factor was their refusal to acknowledge mathematical impossibility. When faced with odds that should have guaranteed defeat, humans seemed to treat them as merely difficult challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. They would analyze the situation, find the smallest possible chance of success, and pursue it with total commitment. The second factor was their ability to improve under pressure. Most species fought worse when badly outnumbered or in desperate situations. Humans seemed to fight better. The worse their situation became, the more creative and determined their responses. It was as if desperation unlocked hidden capabilities they did not normally use. The third factor was their effect on allied forces. When other species saw humans refusing to surrender in impossible situations, it inspired them to fight harder than they normally would. The human refusal to accept defeat became contagious, spreading to other warriors who began to believe that maybe impossible things could be accomplished after all. The fourth factor was their psychological impact on enemies. The Kreth were logical warriors who made tactical decisions based on predictable behavior patterns. But humans did not behave predictably. They did things that made no sense, according to established military theory, which caused enemy forces to make increasingly poor decisions in response. Other species in the Joint Command began to notice these patterns as well. The methodical Andromedans requested detailed analysis of Jake's decision-making processes. Their computers could not model his tactical choices, because he seemed to ignore probability calculations that formed the basis of their warfare algorithms. The fierce Centauri warriors, who prided themselves on courage in battle, admitted grudging respect for what they called Jake's madness in combat. They recognized his bravery, but could not understand how he maintained such intensity for hours at a time without breaking. Even the telepathic vegans were confused by human thought patterns during battle. They reported that Jake's mind during combat focused on only one thing: completing the mission and protecting his comrades. Everything else, including his own survival, became secondary to those goals. Jake himself remained unaware of the attention his fighting style was generating. When asked about his tactics, he would give simple answers about doing his job and helping his team. He seemed genuinely surprised that other species found his behavior remarkable. To him, fighting until the mission was complete was just normal procedure. Zarathic realized she was documenting something that would change how the galaxy understood warfare. These human factors could not be programmed into computers or taught in normal military training. They seemed to come from something deep in human nature that made them approach impossible situations differently than any other known species. The war against the Kreth was far from over, but already the presence of human forces was changing how battles were fought and won. Their refusal to accept defeat was becoming a weapon as important as any plasma rifle or spacecraft. Zarathic wondered what would happen when the enemy finally encountered these human factors in large-scale combat. She would not have to wait long to find out. The liberation of Colony 7 would become the battle that defined everything Zarathic had learned about human warfare. 10,000 civilian refugees were trapped on the planet's surface while Kreth forces used them as shields against orbital bombardment. The Joint Command had spent weeks developing a careful extraction plan that would minimize casualties while achieving their objectives. The operation was a masterpiece of interspecies cooperation. Andromedan computers had calculated precise timing for each phase. Centauri assault teams would create diversions at key points. Vegan mind readers would coordinate communications without detection. Each species would use their specialized abilities in perfect harmony to rescue the civilians and defeat the Kreth forces. The plan required 48 hours to execute properly. Intelligence reports indicated the civilians could survive that long if the Kreth continued to use them as human shields rather than killing them outright. Every military analysis confirmed this was the best possible approach given the complex tactical situation. Jake Murphy sat quietly during the briefing, studying the maps and timetables. When asked if he had questions about the human role in the operation, he simply nodded and said he understood. His unit would provide support for the main assault forces and help evacuate civilians once the primary objectives were secured. Everything went wrong in the first hour. The Kreth had detected their approach despite all precautions. Instead of waiting for the joint force to execute their careful plan, the enemy began killing civilians immediately. They broadcasted the executions on all frequencies, making sure every member of the rescue force could hear the screams and pleas for help. The Joint Command faced an impossible choice. They could continue with their planned operation and accept that hundreds or thousands of civilians would die before they could be rescued, or they could abandon their careful strategy and attempt immediate action that would likely result in complete mission failure and even more civilian casualties. Military doctrine was clear in such situations. Acceptable losses were part of warfare. The plan that offered the best overall chance of success should be followed even if it meant sacrificing some innocents in the short term. Every species represented in the joint force understood this logic and accepted it as necessary. Every species except the humans, Jake Murphy heard the first transmission of civilian executions and stood up from his position. His face was calm, but his eyes had changed in a way that made Zarathic's combat instincts activate. She had seen that look before, in the moments just before he did something that tactical computers said was impossible. "Where are you going, Sergeant?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "To stop them from killing those people, Commander." Jake checked his weapon and began moving toward the Kreth positions. "Sergeant, you cannot assault their position alone. They have 3 defensive perimeters and hundreds of soldiers. The tactical situation makes individual action completely impossible." Jake looked back at her with that same expression she had learned to recognize. It was the look of a human who had decided that mathematics did not matter when innocent people were dying. "Yes, Commander, it probably is impossible, but I have to try anyway." Before anyone could stop him or order him to halt, Jake Murphy broke from the formation and began a direct assault on the Kreth stronghold. He moved across open ground under heavy fire, using every piece of cover and every tactical trick he had learned in months of impossible battles. Zarathic watched through her scope as Jake fought through the first defensive perimeter. He used grenades to create gaps in their lines, then exploited those gaps with precise rifle fire. When his ammunition ran low, he improvised weapons from abandoned equipment and environmental hazards. The Kreth forces tried to respond to his attack using their standard tactical protocols. They calculated his probable routes of advance and set up crossfires to intercept him. They brought additional forces from reserve positions to reinforce threatened areas. They used their superior numbers and prepared positions to create killing zones he would have to cross. But Jake Murphy was not following any tactical protocol they could predict. He moved through their defensive positions like he was solving a puzzle, finding solutions that their computers had not calculated as possible. When they blocked one path, he found another. When they concentrated forces in one area, he appeared somewhere else entirely. The most disturbing thing for the Kreth was that Jake was not using superior technology or overwhelming firepower. He was winning through pure determination and refusal to accept that their defenses could stop him. Every time they thought they had him trapped or defeated, he found a way to keep moving forward. Zarathic realized she was watching something that would be studied in military academies for generations. One human soldier was single-handedly breaking through defensive positions that should have stopped an entire battalion. He was doing it through nothing but absolute refusal to let civilians die while he still had the ability to fight. The second defensive perimeter fell when Jake used their own communication systems against them. He had somehow learned enough of their language during previous battles to send false orders that confused their response patterns. While they were trying to sort out the conflicting commands, he moved through positions they had left temporarily undermanned. By the time Jake reached the third perimeter, where the civilians were being held, the entire Kreth defensive strategy had collapsed. Their logical military algorithms could not process behavior that ignored mathematical probability in favor of moral necessity. they began making increasingly desperate and irrational decisions. Some Kreth soldiers abandoned their positions to pursue Jake directly, leaving gaps in their formations that the joint force could exploit. Others wasted ammunition shooting at areas where they thought he might be, instead of where he actually was. A few even began arguing among themselves about how to respond to tactics that made no sense according to their training. When Jake finally reached the civilian holding area, he was bleeding from multiple wounds, and his armor was cracked and burned. His rifle was almost out of ammunition, and most of his equipment was destroyed or damaged. By every rational measure, he should have been dead several times over, but he was still moving forward, and still fighting. The civilians he found were terrified, and confused, but alive. The Kreth guards had been so focused on responding to Jake's impossible assault that they had stopped the executions to deal with the immediate threat he represented. His irrational attack had accomplished exactly what the careful strategic plan could not. It had made the enemy stop killing innocents. Jake began evacuating civilians, while still under fire from the remaining Kreth forces. He moved groups of refugees to safer positions, while fighting off enemy soldiers who tried to recapture them. When his rifle ammunition finally ran out, he continued fighting with his sidearm and combat knife. The joint force used the confusion Jake had created to launch their own assault. The gaps in the Kreth defensive lines that his attack had opened allowed the other species to advance much faster than their original plan had anticipated. What should have been a 48-hour operation was completed in less than 6 hours. When the battle ended, they found Jake Murphy unconscious in the middle of the refugee evacuation area. He was barely alive from blood loss and injuries, but his body was positioned between the civilians and the last Kreth defensive position. Even unconscious, he had continued trying to protect the people he had risked everything to save. The final casualty count showed that Jake's impossible assault had reduced civilian deaths by over 80% compared to the original strategic projections. Thousands of innocent people were alive because one human had decided that acceptable losses were not acceptable when he still had the power to prevent them. As medical teams worked to save Jake's life, Zarathic stood among the rescued civilians and tried to understand what she had witnessed. The human had not just broken military doctrine or ignored tactical probability. He had redefined what was possible in warfare by refusing to accept that some situations were hopeless. The other species in the joint command gathered around Jake's unconscious form with expressions of confusion and respect. The Andromedans admitted their computers could not calculate how he had succeeded. The Centauri spoke of courage beyond anything in their proud warrior tradition. The Vegans said his mind during the battle had been focused on only one thought: innocent people must not die while he could still fight. When Jake finally woke up in the hospital ship 3 days later, his first question was about the civilians. Only after being assured that they were all safe did he ask about his own injuries. He seemed genuinely surprised that anyone considered his actions remarkable. "I just did what needed to be done," he said when Zarathic visited him. "Someone had to stop them from killing those people. I was there, so it was my job." Zarathic looked at this small, wounded human and realized she had discovered something that would change galactic warfare forever. Jake Murphy had shown her that humans possessed a weapon no other species had: the absolute refusal to accept defeat when defending others, regardless of the mathematical odds against success. She began writing her report to the Galactic Defense Council that night, knowing it would revolutionize how the galaxy understood the nature of courage and the possibilities of warfare when moral necessity overcame tactical logic. Jake Murphy's recovery took longer this time. The injuries from Colony 7 had been severe, and the doctors said he would carry permanent scars from the battle. But within a month he was walking again, and within 2 months he was cleared for light duty. The humans seemed to heal faster when he knew there was work to be done. Zarathic visited him often during his recovery. She had spent weeks thinking about everything she had observed during their months of fighting together. The more she analyzed Jake's actions, the less they made sense, according to any military theory she knew. But the results spoke for themselves. Impossible victories achieved through sheer refusal to accept defeat. During one visit, she decided to ask the question that had been troubling her since their first battle together. "Jake, why do you fight the way you fight? What makes you do things that every tactical computer says cannot be done?" Jake was sitting by the window, looking out at the stars. He had been reading reports about the war's progress and seemed satisfied that things were going well. When Zarathik asked her question, he was quiet for a long time before answering. "I guess it is because someone has to, Commander. When people are in danger and I have the ability to help them, then helping them becomes my responsibility. It does not matter what the odds are or how dangerous it might be. If I can do something, then I should do something. But the mathematical probability of success in most of your actions has been less than 10%. How do you justify taking such risks?" Jake smiled in that gentle way humans did when they were trying to explain something they thought should be obvious. "Math is just numbers, Commander. It tells you what usually happens, but it does not account for what people are willing to sacrifice when something really matters to them." Zarathik clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. "So you believe that determination can overcome statistical probability?" "Not exactly. I believe that when you refuse to give up, you find solutions that you would not have found if you had accepted defeat. The math stays the same, but you keep looking for the one path that leads to success, instead of focusing on all the paths that lead to failure." This was the insight Zarathik had been searching for. Jake was not ignoring mathematics or acting irrationally. He was approaching problems from a fundamentally different perspective than other species. Where they saw probability as limitation, he saw it as challenge. "Tell me about Earth, Jake. Are all humans like you?" Jake laughed softly. "No, Commander. I am just a regular soldier doing my job. But humans have a saying, the difficult we do immediately. The impossible just takes a little longer. We have always had to overcome bad odds to survive and build our civilization." Over the following days, Jake told Zarathik stories about human history. He spoke of battles where small forces had defeated larger ones through determination and clever tactics. He described disasters where humans had saved each other through refusing to abandon hope. He explained how his species had learned to see impossible challenges as problems waiting for solutions. Each story revealed the same pattern Zarathik had observed in combat. Humans did not fight to win in the traditional sense. They fought because losing was unacceptable when others depended on them. This fundamental difference in motivation created tactical advantages that could not be calculated or predicted. When Jake was fully recovered, Zarathik requested permission to conduct a comprehensive study of human military psychology. The High Command approved her request immediately. Her preliminary reports about Jake's combat effectiveness had already started changing strategic planning throughout the galactic military. She interviewed dozens of human soldiers and found the same basic patterns in all of them. They approached warfare as a series of problems to be solved, rather than contests to be won or lost. When faced with impossible odds, they focused on finding the one solution that might work, instead of calculating all the reasons why failure was likely. More importantly, humans fought for different reasons than other species. The Androids fought with logical precision to achieve strategic objectives. The Centauri fought with fierce pride to prove their courage and strength. The Vegans fought with coordinated intelligence to protect their collective consciousness. Humans fought because other people needed them to fight. This simple motivation created behavioral patterns that no enemy could counter because it was based on moral necessity, rather than tactical calculation. When Jake Murphy charged impossible positions or held hopeless defensive lines, he was not trying to be heroic or prove anything about himself. He was simply doing what needed to be done to protect others. Zarathik's final report to the Galactic Defense Council became the most important military document of the war. She called it Analysis of Human Tactical Psychology and Its Applications in Multi-Species Operations. The conclusions would reshape how the galaxy understood warfare itself. Human military effectiveness operates on principles unknown to other species, she wrote. They possess an intrinsic psychological inability to accept defeat when defending others. This creates tactical advantages that cannot be calculated using traditional probability models. Humans do not fight to achieve victory in the conventional sense. They fight because allowing defeat is psychologically unacceptable when others depend on their protection. This fundamental difference in motivation produces combat behaviors that appear irrational but consistently achieve results that exceed mathematical predictions. Recommendation: human military integration should be prioritized, not for their technology or superior numbers, but for their unique psychological approach to impossible situations. They transform probability mathematics into irrelevant theory, through absolute commitment to mission success when others are at risk. The report included detailed analysis of Jake's 17 major engagements, showing how his refusal to accept defeat had created victory conditions that no tactical computer had predicted. It demonstrated how human psychology could be used to break enemy formations that relied on logical response patterns. Most importantly, it explained how the presence of humans affected other species in combat situations. When Allied forces saw humans refusing to surrender in hopeless circumstances, it inspired them to fight beyond their normal capabilities. The human approach to impossible odds became contagious, spreading to entire multi-species units. The war against the Kreth ended 6 months after Zarathik submitted her report. The enemy forces, programmed for logical warfare, could not adapt to tactics based on moral necessity rather than strategic calculation. Their defeat came not from superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but from their inability to counter an enemy that refused to accept mathematical impossibility. Jake Murphy returned to Earth, with honors from 17 different species and recognition as the soldier who had changed galactic warfare forever. He accepted the medals politely, but seemed more interested in getting home to see his family. When reporters asked him about his famous battles, he gave simple answers about doing his duty and helping his teammates. Zarathik kept a copy of every report she had written about Jake. She read them sometimes when she wanted to remember what she had learned about the nature of courage and determination. The human had taught her that victory was not about probability or superior firepower. It was about refusing to quit when others needed you to succeed. Years later, when new species joined the galactic community and asked about human military capabilities, Zarathik would tell them the same thing. Humans were not the strongest or fastest or smartest species in the galaxy. They did not have special powers or advanced technology that made them superior warriors. What humans had was something more dangerous than any weapon: the absolute inability to accept defeat when protecting others. They would fight impossible battles and hold hopeless positions and charge overwhelming odds, because losing was simply not an option when people depended on them. This psychological weapon could not be programmed into computers or taught to other species. It came from something deep in human nature that made them see moral necessity as more important than tactical probability. When humans fought, they did not fight to win. They fought because fighting was the right thing to do. And in a galaxy full of logical warriors and calculated strategies, that simple human truth had proven to be the most powerful force of all. Jake Murphy never fully understood why other species considered his actions remarkable. To him and his fellow humans, fighting beyond hope was not extraordinary courage. It was simply what they did when others needed their protection. For humans, impossible just meant they had to try a little harder.